Right now, something big is being talked about across Washington, Wall Street, and the crypto space at the same time. And no, this isn't hype, it isn't a price prediction, and it isn't financial advice. This is about regulation, structure, and a moment that could reshape how digital assets are treated in the United States. If you've been following XRP for any amount of time, you already know that moments like this don't come often. Before we go any further, let me say this clearly. This video is for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing here is a recommendation to buy or sell anything. Crypto markets are volatile, regulations evolve, and outcomes are never guaranteed. Now that that's clear, let's talk about why so many people are paying attention right now. There are growing reports and discussions around a US Senate vote connected to regulatory clarity for digital assets, often referred to publicly as a Clarity Act. What matters here is not hype, but what regulatory clarity actually means. For years, the crypto industry has operated in uncertainty, not illegality, uncertainty, and uncertainty is something institutions hate more than volatility. XRP has lived inside that uncertainty longer than almost any other major digital asset. While other projects came and went, XRP stayed in the spotlight because it sat directly at the intersection of finance, technology, and regulation. That position made it controversial, debated, and often misunderstood. When people hear phrases like Senate vote or regulatory clarity, emotions spike immediately. Some assume instant price movement. Others assume nothing will change. Both reactions miss the deeper point. Regulation doesn't work like a switch. It works like a framework. And frameworks change behavior long before they change charts. If lawmakers move toward clearer definitions around digital assets, the first impact isn't speculation, it's participation. Institutions don't enter markets because they feel excited. They enter when risk is defined. They enter when compliance is possible. They enter when rules exist. That's why clarity matters more than approval. Approval sounds dramatic. Clarity sounds boring, but boring is exactly what large financial systems need. XRP's design has always been aligned with that world. It wasn't built to rebel against banks. It was built to interact with them. That single fact has shaped every conversation around XRP for over a decade. Now, here's where things get interesting. In the United States, regulatory discussions send signals far beyond the crypto community. They influence payment providers, custodians, exchanges, fintech companies, and international partners watching from the outside. When the US moves toward clarity, the world pays attention. That doesn't mean everything changes overnight. It means doors that were closed begin to unlock slowly. A lot of people misunderstand how adoption happens. They expect announcements, headlines, and fireworks. Real adoption happens quietly. It happens in meetings, pilot programs, compliance reviews, and infrastructure planning. By the time the public notices, much of the work is already done. That's why moments like this matter. Not because of what they promise, but because of what they allow. For XRP specifically, clarity has always been the missing piece. Not technology, not scalability, not speed. Those boxes were checked years ago. The missing variable was regulatory certainty. That's why discussions around US legislative clarity feel so heavy. They're not about one token. They're about how digital assets fit into the existing financial system. If you're still watching, take a second to hit the like button. It helps this kind of calm, policy-safe content reach people who want understanding, not panic. And if you want more updates explained without hype, make sure you subscribe. Now let's zoom out. Markets don't react to laws the way social media reacts to headlines. Markets react to incentives. When uncertainty decreases, participation increases. When participation increases, liquidity improves. When liquidity improves, systems become more usable. This isn't about XRP winning. It's about XRP being usable in environments that require compliance. For years, critics said regulation would kill crypto. In reality, regulation filters crypto. It removes projects that can't adapt and highlights those that can. XRP has already been through that filter. That's why this moment feels different to longtime observers. Not because of excitement, but because of alignment. Technology, regulation, and institutional readiness don't often line up at the same time. It's also important to understand what this moment is not. It is not a guarantee of price appreciation. It is not a signal that risk disappears. It is not permission to abandon caution. What it is a shift in conversation. For the first time in a long time, discussions around XRP are less about survival and more about structure, less about legality and more about integration. That alone changes how serious players think. Financial institutions don't ask, will this pump tomorrow? They ask, can this function within our risk framework over the next decade? That's the conversation clarity enables. If you've ever wondered why price sometimes doesn't move even when good news appears, this is why. Markets price expectations, not headlines. If clarity has been anticipated, price may already reflect that expectation. If clarity surprises, reaction may come later. And sometimes, price doesn't react at all. Because the impact isn't speculative, it's structural. Structural change is slow, but it lasts. Another thing worth mentioning is that legislation doesn't act alone. It interacts with existing court decisions, regulatory guidance, and agency behavior. That's why responsible discussion avoids absolute statements. No law instantly settles every question, but each step reduces friction, and friction is the enemy of adoption. For XRP, less friction means more optionality. Optionality doesn't force outcomes, it allows them. That's a subtle but critical difference. As this conversation continues to evolve, emotions will rise. Some voices will exaggerate. Others will dismiss everything entirely. Neither extreme helps. What helps is understanding process. Legislative clarity doesn't belong to one asset, but assets designed to operate within regulated systems stand to benefit from clarity more than those that don't. That's not favoritism. That's alignment. If you're planning to animate this for a 15-minute video, pacing matters. This moment isn't about shouting. It's about controlled intensity, calm confidence, suspense built through understanding, not shock. Because the real suspense isn't what happens tomorrow, it's what becomes possible next. What becomes possible next is not something you can measure with a single candle on a chart, and it's not something that shows up instantly on a price tracker. It shows up first in behavior. It shows up in how companies plan, how institutions talk internally, and how seriously a technology is evaluated when risk teams are involved. In the United States, regulation doesn't just shape what is allowed, it shapes what is taken seriously. And for years, digital assets existed in a gray zone where seriousness was constantly questioned. That gray zone didn't stop innovation, but it slowed adoption at the highest levels. Clarity begins to change that dynamic. For XRP, this shift matters because its original design assumed a regulated world. It assumed compliance requirements. It assumed reporting, oversight, and accountability. Those assumptions didn't make headlines in the early days of crypto, but they matter deeply now as the industry matures. When lawmakers debate clarity, they're not debating price. They're debating definitions. They're debating jurisdiction. They're debating responsibility. And once those elements are defined, entire categories of participation become possible. Think about what large financial institutions need before they can engage meaningfully. They need clear asset classification. They need custody standards. They need compliance pathways. They need legal certainty. Without those things, even the best technology remains sidelined. This is why long-term observers are paying attention right now, not because they expect fireworks, but because they recognize signals. Signals don't shout, they whisper. Another thing that often gets overlooked is how regulation affects infrastructure providers. Exchanges, custodians, payment processors, and liquidity providers all operate under regulatory constraints. When those constraints become clearer, these entities can expand services, onboard new clients, and support new use cases. That expansion doesn't happen overnight. It happens through planning cycles, approvals, integrations, and testing. Each step adds friction, but clarity reduces uncertainty, which makes the friction manageable. For XRP, reduced uncertainty has always been the key variable. The technology didn't need reinvention. The market environment needed definition. This is also where a lot of misunderstanding comes in. Some people expect regulation